Welcome to Conversations. I am Muqtedar, your host, and today I'm going to tell you the story of Asia. And the story of Asia, when it is told, normally people talk about the rise of China as the second biggest economy, China as the challenge to the United States, both in the economic sphere as well as in the geopolitical sphere, the rise of Chinese hegemony, especially in East Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. But often people, while they recognize that India is now the fastest growing economy in the world, what they don't realize is that the rise of India has simultaneously paralleled the decline of Japan. So we saw Asia rise even before globalization begins in the 1990 after collapse of the Soviet Union and the liberalization of global economy as well as individual economies, especially in China and India. But surprisingly, the economy that did well before globalization, which was Japan, did so horribly since globalization to such an extent that the 35 years that we have had the global economy since 1991 till now, Japan has only once clocked a growth rate of over 4%. So, the story that I'm going to tell you about Asia is the rise of India and the decline of Japan. So, I'm going to show you lots of graphs. So, please watch this show. I know many of you listen to it on your phones while you're traveling, etc. But I recommend that you look at it. I'm going to show you about a dozen graphs, lots of bar graphs, in which I'm going to show you relative rise of GDPs, growth rates, and compare it with some other economies to give you an idea as to how the global economy changed since 1980 till now. So basically, in the last 45 years, what has happened to the top five economies in the world, who is in, who is out, and then along with that, I will tell you the story about the rise of India and the decline of Japan, because some of the conditions which have led to the decline of Japan are more or less very similar to what China is currently experiencing and India might experience in about 20 years. So let's begin. What I want to essentially show you is a series of charts. But before that, if you have not already subscribed to Conversations, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, press the bell icon, and don't forget to share this video with your socio-political network. So this is the story that I'm going to tell you, the rise of India and the decline of Japan. So you see here essentially a GDP chart in bar graphs from 1980 to 2025. So in 1980, you see that Japan was about $1.1 trillion and India was around 200 and odd billion dollars. And then you see in 1990, Japan really doubles, more than doubles in 10 years. Its GDP goes from about one and a half to about $3 trillion, and then it continues to grow at a very rapid pace. It reaches $5 trillion in 2000, $4 trillion in 2005, plus $1 trillion in 2010. That is the peak of the Japanese economy. And then from 2010 onwards, it's steadily declining. But you can see that India has been steadily rising since 1980 to 2025. And it's in 2025 that these two economies are now more or less parallel, with India getting a slight edge. At the end of this year, India will be 4.187, 4 trillion 187 billion, and Japan is forecasted to be 4,186 billion. So it will be slightly behind India. India is expected to overtake Japan and become the fourth largest economy by the end of this year, just behind US, China, and Germany. So this is the story that you can see of how things have changed in 1980. Japan, and again in 2000, Japan was nearly 5 times bigger than India. And what it also tells you is that 2.5 decades are enough to completely alter the fortunes of nations. Uh, and so yes, time matters, but things are happening so fast in the age that we live in, that we can say that in 10 years' time things are going to be profoundly different from what they are at the moment when it comes to the global economy, global distribution of power, and balance of power. Uh, in this chart, what I'm going to show you is how the world, how the top five economies looked like in 1980. So in 1980, if you were to look at the distribution of power in terms of uh, uh, wealth, you can see that the United States was about $3 trillion, one tenth of what it is now. So in U.S. has grown 10 times in the last 45 years. So the US was about $3 trillion. Japan was the second biggest economy, about $750 billion. A little bit more than that. So it was about 1.1, 1.2 in 1980, followed by Germany, France, and United Kingdom. And you can see that even today, the top three economies are US, Japan, and US, Japan, and Germany in the top four, with China in the number second spot. So in that sense, you could say, look, not much has changed. France and UK, which were four and five, are six and seven at the moment. Six or nine probably, but France is still in the top 10. So this hasn't changed much, but you will see the rise of Asia. So if you look at 1990, the pecking order remains the same, with the US basically doubling itself from 1980 to 1990. I mean, these are stories of economic progress about the US which are not highlighted and recognized. The US doubled its GDP from 1980 to 1990. Uh, just imagine that. That's phenomenal. It became a $6 trillion. Japan, as I've already said, was growing. The pecking order remains the same, except you suddenly see the UK drops out temporarily, and Italy reaches the fifth highest. So basically, what you're seeing here is basically G7. The current G7 is right here. The only countries that are missing is from 1990 is Great Britain and Canada. You come to 2000, and then you see that 2000 is also more or less like 1980, not much difference. And then, boom, you come to 20, to from 2000, you move to 2010. So 1990 to 2000 was essentially the opening of the global economy. Reforms took place everywhere. The Soviet Union had collapsed. And then you see in 2010, you suddenly see China out of nowhere appear as the second biggest economy, pushing Japan from number second spot to third spot. So all these years, Japan was enjoying basically the second place in the economy. From 1980 onwards, it was the second biggest economy. And then you see Japan falling in 2010 to the third spot. And then you come to 2020, and Japan is it's still US, China, Japan, with Germany moving up to the fourth spot, and India now appearing for the first time at the fifth spot. So China reaches the top five economies for the first time in 2010, where it is jumped straight to the second spot. And India in 2020 joins the top five economies at the fifth spot. And now in 2025, at the end of 2025, India will be the fourth biggest economy. And Germany continues to hang in there, but France and Britain are out of the top five economies. So you can see basically right now that in 1980, if you look at 1980, there was only one Asian countries and four European countries in the top five. And now you see there are three Asian countries and two Western countries. Sorry, US is part of the West, not Europe, but two Western countries, two NATO countries in the top five. I mean, this is why we have the pivot to Asia. This is why we have the Indo-Pacific strategy as far as the US is concerned, because the center of gravity of the global economy has shifted to Asia. So this is the story of Asia that is generally told. It is very well known for most of you who are students of geopolitics or geoeconomics, or who just observe the global economy. This, and what I've said so far is a well-known conventional wisdom. So you must be wondering where the hell is Soviet Union here? Why I have not mentioned Soviet Union? So if you look at the 1980 chart, I have not shown you the Soviet Union, neither in the 1990. So let me give you some idea of the Soviet Union's economy. So USSR from 1970, I went a decade behind because the Soviet Union disappeared after 1990. You can see that the Soviet Union was at its peak in 1980. It had a GDP of little more than $2 trillion, and then it basically became half within 10 years. From 1980 to 1990, Soviet Union went from above $2 trillion to one. So basically, it lost $1 trillion in GDP from 1980 to 1990. And in that same period, from 1980 to 1990, the US went from $3 to $6 trillion. And that should tell you why the Soviet Union basically disappeared from existence. Soviet Union was comparable to the US in 1980. The US was about $3 trillion, and the Soviet Union at its peak was about 2.2, $2.3 trillion. But from 1980 to 1990, this is the Reagan era. The US doubled its GDP from basically $3 to $6 trillion, and the Soviet Union went basically from 2.3 to 1 point something, $1.2 trillion, lost a trillion. So that is where the balance of power completely shifted and Soviet Union disappeared. This is a consolidated graph of 7 countries that fitted into the top 5 economies. I've left the Soviet Union out, and Russia doesn't figure in the top 5 at all. It does when you make on 1 or 2 years if you make adjustment for purchasing power parity, and it is basically in the top 12 or top 14 economies in the world. It's about $2 trillion right now, but China is 20 and the US is $30 trillion. So you can see that Russia doesn't even uh, feature into any form of comparison. So if you look at here, you can see the story of Asia here. Clearly, there is rise. You can see the decline of European economies relatively and the rise of Asian economies. But what is interesting is that while we focus on the growth of India and the growth of China, what we constantly ignore is the phenomenal rise of the United States in the same period. I wish Donald Trump would watch one of my shows, or at least this show, and he should realize that the US is not declining as much as he thinks it does. So, for example, the US in 2020 was about $23 trillion. And in 2025, it is about $30 trillion. We have added $7 trillion in the last 5 years. So in the last 5 years, basically, we have added a combination of Japan and India, the third and the fourth biggest economies, to our GDP, or the fourth and the fifth biggest economies, roughly that much to our economy in just the last 5 years. So the US's story is also quite spectacular that needs to be recognized. So the US goes from a $3 trillion economy to a $30 trillion economy in the last 45 years, whereas China basically goes let me see what it was in 200. China was in 2000 pretty high already. It had reached about uh, $13 trillion in 2020, sorry. So in 2000, China did not feature in, but in 2010, China was about $5 trillion. So in the last 15 years, China has basically gone from about $6 trillion to 20. So it has tripled in the last 15 years, and the US has grown 10 times in the last 45 years. So these are some of the phenomenal stories about the global economy. Let's turn to comparing India and Japan. So let me show you this graph, and you can see the Japanese growth rates. Now, I'm not talking about GDP, I'm talking about the rate at which the GDP has been growing. So this is what I generated this graph. And in this graph, I wanted to earmark those years with above 5% growth as red, above 4% with green, and below 4% with black. And you can see that since 1991, since the era of globalization began, so in the last 35 years, this is the period where China and India have done phenomenally well and Europe began to decline, you can see that Japan has had only 1 year with a growth rate above 4%. Most of this data is from the IMF. Uh, and that is spectacular. I mean, it does have 2020 with a negative growth of more than 4%. That's because of COVID. But 2009, after the world crisis, it went down by 5%. And again in 1998, it went down by 2%. And so it has had several years, 7 years of the last 35 years, it has had negative growth. And only once in the last 35 years has a growth rate of over 4%. And Japan basically has been growing at an average of 1%, but its economy has declined. It was at one point close to $6 trillion, and now it is $4 trillion. It is two-thirds of what it was at its peak. There is no other major economy in the past 35 years that has experienced such negative GDP growth. But if you look at India on the same chart, last 35 years, I this is what I essentially generated. Above 8% is red, above 7% is green, and below 7% is black. So everything that you see is 8 is red is above 8%. So if you look at the Indian growth rate in since 1991 till now, of the 35 years, a majority of time, India is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. So, okay, majority 18 times it was below 7%. Let's blame it on COVID. So 18 times below 7% and 17 times above 7%. But it has had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years above 8%. Now, that is why we talk about India's growth story as something spectacular. That is why it became on the verge of becoming the fourth biggest economy. And by the end of 2030, by the end of this decade, it will be the third biggest economy, overtaking Germany. I won't even be surprised if it happens by 2027. We don't even have to wait till 2030 because Germany is flirting with zero growth rates and probably recession. So this is a spectacular story of India's growth rates. In the past 10 years, it has had only 3 years with 8% growth. India needs over 8.5% growth rate every year for the next 22 years to become a high income economy, a fully developed nation. The word that is bandied about in India is called Viksit Bharat. So for India to become a high income economy, it needs to grow at in the red color for the next 22 years, above 8%. But this is a very spectacular story. I'm not comparing with China, which is the only other country in the world which has had this kind and better growth rates. So basically, around 1980, sometime in 1980, both India and China were on the same level. Uh, I'm forgetting which year it was. I think it was 1987. But since then, China has grown so fast, then it is 5 times bigger than India. So India is at $4 trillion and China is at $20 trillion. So China's growth has been spectacular. I will be discussing China in a few more days with a very important economist, so I don't want to refer more to China today. So what are the reasons for this? So that is the main question. What are the reasons for the rise and fall of Japan, and what are the reasons for the rise of India? So I'm going to identify the top three reasons for the spectacular growth of Japan after World War II until globalization began. Uh, After looking at the literature and going through the research, I was surprised. I thought innovation, technological innovation, the creation of companies like Honda and Toyota, Sony, and all of those electronics. So it was the innovation in the electronics sector, which was the primary reason. But looking at it from a macro perspective, I found some other reasons which are also very interesting. First of all, number one that I found interesting was that the literature suggests, I'm looking at development literature essentially. So the development literature studies that one of the reasons for the growth of Japan was the strategic role that the government played. So Japan was not exactly a free market; it was a government-driven market. So there was a lot of understanding between the Japan's trade industry, trade ministry, and its economic ministry, its commerce ministry, as well as the government. In fact, I actually wrote a paper many years ago talking about the theology of Islamic economics and the theology of East Asian growth and the mythology of Islamic economics, where I talked about how the consultation between the industry and the government, it was a partnership, public-private partnership, which actually contributed to to good policies on taxation, on trade, etc., on subsidies, which allowed Japan to grow at a very rapid pace, faster than Europe, faster than North America. And so we saw the Japanese economic miracle from the 1950s till 1990. So the number one reason was basically the role of government. So it was not free market which was responsible for fantastic growth, but strategic government intervention. I'm surprised that we have not learned that. Donald Trump is trying to do that right now, but his interventions have not yet. Well, it's only 6 months, but we will see what happens by the end of his term, whether such micro interventions from the government in the economy, in trade, in policy, etc., benefits the economy or not. The second reason was high savings. Apparently, the Japanese, unlike most other countries, especially countries which are developing and saving rates for some of these countries was 7 to 8. Japanese were even saving at as high a rate as 18%. So the personal saving rate of the Japanese population was 18%. They were saving one fifth of everything that they made. And those fixed deposits in banks and those savings were then used as capital for development. Therefore, Japan did not need to borrow money to invest in its economy, in its development, and pay interest rates to foreign countries or etc. So, in that sense, it was an interesting um, example of how the culture of a country can also help it in its development. And the cultural aspect was the 18% of the disposable income that was being saved, compared to, say, 7 to 8% in the rest of the Soviet Union countries. So that was one second more important reason why the Japanese were able to develop at such a high rate. And the third reason was apparently the Korean War, and that to me was quite surprising that during the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, immediately after the World War, within 5 years, where Japan was reconstructing and development, there was a huge transfer of wealth from the U.S. to Japan because the U.S. was fighting a war in Korea, and it was buying huge quantities of food and war materials and supplies from Japan. And because of U.S. war expenditure in the Korean Peninsula, Japan became extremely beneficial. You saw that kind of possibility in Pakistan when they benefited from the war on terror. They got about $33 billion of aid from the United States, except that they didn't use it well. But Japan apparently used all the wealth that it was receiving because of the basically stuff that the US was buying. These are the top three. There are many other reasons, like I said, technological development, investments in infrastructure, investments in engineering companies, and if foreign trade focused development strategy of Japan was also a reason for its growth. Now, the reason for Japan's decline was number one was something you have heard before. the asset bubble burst. So there was a lot of investments in apartments, in construction, etc. And so the real estate market in Japan also dropped. Something that we have seen happen in Japan, in China, and China's growth rates from 8 to 9% have dropped to 4 to 5%, and 30% of its GDP used to be coming from basically construction industry, and that has disappeared because of the construction bubble and that burst in China. So what happened in Japan also happened in China. So this is perhaps a learning thing for India, that you might witness a construction as well as real estate bubble burst in the near future. So be alert to that. The second reason for Japan's decline is demographics and structural level, the decline of productivity, basically. Japan's per capita income also has been on the steady decline. It doesn't compare to, say, Germany, which is at 55,000. Japan is just 35,000 per capita. Germany is 55, the US is 90,000, 85 to 90,000. So you can see it hasn't kept pace with the other two major economies. But one reason why is a decline in productivity. They work lesser hours. They're not as, the population is not as productive, and there is a demographic, which means the population is growing older and shrinking. There are more people on welfare and few people in the workforce. So that is a huge challenge, and China is also facing this challenge in the next. The challenge has begun. China's population is 1.4 billion at the moment, and it's expected to drop within the next 30, 40 years to 800 million. It'll become more or less half of what it is. And so the absence of the workforce, plus it's also a smaller market. So domestic consumption will definitely go down, and there will be less workforce. So either they take in more immigrants, or they, you know, basically automate and use AI and robots essentially to replace human beings in the workforce. The third reason has been bad monetary policies by Japan, which has resulted in deflation, etc. And I don't want to go into the details of that because they're a bit difficult to explain in a short video like this. But you can see deflation is something that is also happening in China, and as a result of deflation, say inflation is when cost of things goes up, deflation is when the cost of things goes down, and stagnation is when it remains. So what happens when you're in a state of deflation is that people don't want to buy. So for example, I want to buy a laptop. A laptop costs $2,000, but due to deflation, I know that next month it will cost $1,900. So I say, well, let me buy it next month. It'll be cheaper. So next month, when I thinking of buying it at 1,900, I feel that, oh my God, 2 months from now it'll be 1,500. So why should I give 1,900 now? Let me wait 2 months. This old one is working okay. I can manage it. So that's what happens in deflation. It reduces domestic consumption, and then the GDP begins to fall. And that is something that Japan experienced, and it is quite possible that China may also experience that. It is experiencing actually a decline in domestic consumption right now because of deflation. That's why it's, like I said, its growth rates have dropped from 8, 9% to 4% to 5%. And it is trying to compensate that by extremely heavy focus on export-oriented manufacturing. So that's the story of the rise and fall of Japan. So what are the reasons why India is doing well? So some of the reasons which are leading to the decline of Japan, the opposite of that you can see in India. So for example, the demographic decline is contributing to less domestic consumption, absence of labor force, etc. in Japan, but India is enjoying a demographic dividend. It has a huge middle class right now and rising. And so the domestic consumption is driving the growth of the economy. So one of the reasons why the Indian economy is growing is because the domestic population is growing, it is vibrant, and so there is a growing middle class of maybe 3 to 400 million people, which is as big as the European Union. The whole population of European Union is 450 million, and India has an upper middle. If you take the lower and lower middle and upper middle class, and etc., you would have a middle class in India, which is as big as Europe itself. And so that's one of the driving reasons for domestic consumption driving manufacturing, agriculture, and other things. The second is investment, capital investments by government. Both state and central governments are investing heavily in infrastructure and borrowing money, yes, but investing in roads, in buildings, in airports, in highways, in schools, in education, etc. And all of that is contributing to growth in GDP. And of course, the greatest story is connected. The two other reasons for the growth of India's economy is one is digital transformation. More and more people are becoming competent using computers and the internet, etc. And that has made the middle class also grow. And it has also then resulted in a huge IT service sector. So India's IT service sector and IT exports, which are about $300 billion, are one of the biggest stories of reasons for India's success. So the resilience of the growth of the IT sector and IT services and export of IT services, which also is creating jobs, etc., is also a very important reason. The sad side of the Indian story is the absence of the significant growth in manufacturing. So if you looked at the stories of the rise of Japan, the rise of Germany, the rise of China now, and the rise of U.S. 100 years ago, was all because of very rapid growth of industrialization and manufacturing. And then, of course, India is also doing well because of its fiscal policies and the liberalization that took place since 1991. India has been moving away from a socialist model to essentially a capitalist model. So India has become more business friendly. And so the liberalization also is one of the main reasons why India's economy suddenly took off after 1991. It does have a few challenges. I did a whole conversation called Five Trends in India, which will have a long-term impact with the distinguished economist Amirullah Khan. You can watch that video. I'm not going to dwell upon the negatives at this moment in this video because India is rising. So we'll talk about the need to talk about the reasons why the economy is declining is if the economy declines. India is right now the fastest growing major economy. And as I said, it is the fifth. This year it will become the fourth biggest. And within 2 years, inshallah, it will become the third biggest economy in the world. So, so this is the story that uh, is often, while many people do talk about India's growth rate, what they don't realize is the Asia story is not just about the rise of China. It is the rise of China, the rise of India, and the decline of Japan. And all three at the moment are in the top five economies. I don't think Japan will be there too long. In another 20 years, Japan will be replaced by Indonesia. So when we look at the top economies in the world, the top economies will be China, India, the United States, and Indonesia in the fourth place. Uh, and I'm looking at Goldman Sachs prediction for the 2075, and according to it, in the top five, Nigeria, and number six will be Pakistan, another Asian country. So basically, Europeans are out of the top five, including Japan. So the G7 in 2075 is going to look very different. The only country that is going to hang around is the United States. And I said that the spectacular growth of India and China has overlooked the fact that even the US has had a spectacular half a century since 1980s. So anyway, I hope you found that interesting. So please subscribe to Conversation, like this video, press the bell icon, and don't forget to share this video with your socio-political network. I want to share the good news that my channel is now visible in India. So I hope a lot of you who were unable to watch my shows will now come back to watch the shows. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time, I'm your host, Muqtedar Khan. Take care.